My underpainting for my Zorn fruit still life is complete, and now I'm ready to start blocking in colors with my Zorn palette. I have my Zorn palette pre-mixed on my disposable palette. Make sure that you do it the long way so that you have enough room for all of the color scales. And so what I have here is the yellow ochre, the mix between the yellow ochre and the cadmium red, the mix between the cadmium red and the black and the mix between the black and the yellow ochre. So effectively that makes yellow, orange, red, purple, blue, and green. You'll notice that for each scale, I mixed about 3 to 4 values depending on the color. Some of the lighter colors like the green and the yellow, I got about 3 values out of them. Some of the darker colors like the black and the purple, I got about 4 values out of them. I could go lighter, but I decided not to. I wanted my lightest values to be close to a halftone value. So on an actual value scale, that might be number 2 or number 3, depending on how many values you have. But if I want to go lighter, I can always add white to these colors. But I'm most likely not going to do that at this stage, because if I'm going that light, it will most likely be reserved for very minute reflection points or highlights. But at this stage, I'm just filling in major surface areas, major values, and major colors. So I'd have no need to go that light. So that's why my lightest values are not lighter than this. Another thing is by only mixing 3 to 4 values, that gives me more room on my palette because I'm going to be doing some on-the-spot mixing. So for example, if I want to make a color that has yellow in it, like the green or the orange, lighter in value, I don't necessarily need to pick from here, which has white in it. I can also make a color lighter by adding yellow to it. So if a color has yellow in it, like the green or the orange, you're maybe better off mixing more yellow into it to get a lighter value. Additionally, the orange is a lighter value of the red, so rather than, if I need a lighter red, rather than just going here first, I may want to consider, can I use the orange as a light plane for a red object? In the case of the orange, the fruit that I'm painting, I would probably be sticking to more of the warmer tones without the white in it to get some of the lighter values. And then also, if I want any of these colors that I mixed to be slightly shifted any one way, I can do that. So if I want a bluer looking green, I can just mix a little bit more black into what I have here. Before you actually mix out your tints, you want to make sure that all of your in-between colors that you mix, the orange, the purple, and the green, are visually correct. You don't want them to lean too much towards, like for instance, you don't want the green to lean too much towards the black or too much towards the yellow. You want it to be looking like it's in the middle. And then if we need to shift it any which way, we can do that on the spot with the brush. So we have enough room here to do some of that on the spot mixing. So using my flat brush, I'm going to take my palette in my hand and I'm going to start filling in the colors where I see them. So again, this is similar to paint by number type approach because I have my values and composition already established with my underpainting. So at this point, the next factor that I need to add in is hue. And I can do that. It's really worth the time to pre-mix all your colors ahead of time before you begin. It doesn't matter whether you're going to use all of them or not. You probably will end up using most of them. But having this reference of all the hues with their values is going to help you identify the correct color that needs to go in the right place. So for example, if I start with this, my orange here, the light area that is receiving light is usually some of the more saturated areas. So I may want to put my most saturated orange in that area right there. So I'm going to take some of this orange and maybe add a little bit of yellow to it because it might be a little bit dark. So adding the yellow to it will also lighten it, but keep the warmth of it. If I went to this color here, which has a lot of white in it, it's not only lighter, but it's a cooler version of this yellow-orange. So I can take this color and start filling it in for this light plain area of the orange. I'm trying to fill in the shape, but also not lose any of the information, like this little dot that I put there. And I can always adjust it slightly while it's wet. So if I feel like I'm adding a little bit more orange back into that color. Okay. And so now for the shadow area of the orange, this color I'm picking up this now. It starts to turn away from the light here. And this area, the shadow mass on the orange, it has some green in it. So what I might do is to make it slightly more green, I may take some of this gray here and make a mix, because the yellow from the orange and the bluish pigment from the black is going to make a kind of desaturated green. So I can use that for this shadow area here. I want the edges to go right up to each other. I don't want to see the underpainting peeking through between values, especially for areas where it needs to be a darker value. And so that is a good start for that. And then I might just take this similar value that I have here, maybe a little bit lighter. Shadows are really closer to a middle value. And I'm doing what's called scumbling. I'm just sort of dragging the paint across the surface so it becomes a little bit more transparent. And when you see some of the underpainting through the shadow areas, it actually creates a nice vibration of the warm and the cool together. So there's no occlusion shadow yet. I can always add that later, and that's okay. So now I can move on to the bananas. I'm going to wash my brush. And the bananas are, well, we know bananas to be yellow, but these bananas and any bananas really, they have a lot of green in them. So even if I was using a full palette, I still wouldn't paint them bright yellow. The bright yellow may not even exist on the banana. It might have more of a place on the orange, actually, in some of the highlight areas. But with the banana, it's more of a yellowish green, and then the shadow areas are much more desaturated. So I'm going to use probably a mix of my yellow with my green. So I'm going to take some from this pile and sort of add it here. And I'm going to start filling in just the light planes. So I want it to be a little bit more yellow than that. So I'm going in, there's almost too much white in it, so I'm just adding more yellow to that same mix. Okay, that's better. And just filling in the light plane areas. So this stage can also be about correcting. Now you can see that as it moves to this plane of the banana, it gets much more green and slightly darker. So I'm just mixing to the side here. It's also a more bluer green, so I maybe want to add a little bit more black to that green so it's not so warm and it looks a bit cooler. And again, I want to go right up to the edge of that other shape. And this would be a good time to start making any corrections to the shapes, minor corrections. So we don't want to make major edits at this point, but we want to sort of start to refine the shapes. I'm going to take that same color and fill it in here where I see it. I also see it here. A little bit there. Alright, I'm going to wash my brush and go back to that light plain color of the banana. You see how the palette is helping me keep my values organized, so it's less confusing. Value can be kind of tricky to nail if you don't have any reference, because value is relative. So if we don't see it in comparison to something, it's going to be hard to know if it's the right value. I'm going to fill in this area here. Make sure that you have mixed enough paint. If you're running out of paint, mix more. And if you don't have enough on your palette, you need to get some more from your tubes. That color is also here. I see a little bit of yellow. So this initial layer of color that I'm putting down, it can be refined as I start painting details, but what I want right now is an approximation. So just like how the underpainting was an approximation of values, this is an approximation of color. And then when I go into the last stage and start refining details, I can get a little bit more accurate with color. Sort of a darkness over there. And here. Okay, so this shadow here, it looks more orange than these shadows that looked green, and that's because there's reflected light bouncing off of the orange back onto that shadow. So I want to show that by mixing, getting my more orangey looking mix, my orangey green looking mix, and putting that there. Showing the color in the shadows and the reflected light, that is what's going to make your painting come alive. I'm going to use that same shadow color here because that same light is bouncing off the orange onto those areas. Okay, and there's a little bit of the light plane showing here. I want to indicate that. And this dark color here is close to maybe some of these purples, because this gray, this black, is going to look too blue. So I can take this color and put that in. Even though it's dark, I don't want to use the darkest color I have. I want to reserve those for occlusion shadows. Now up here, this part, there's a little bit of darkness on this side, but it is mostly maybe more like this value. And there's even some more lightness. I just grabbed some of the yellow. It's almost like a gray. Okay. Okay, so now I can move on to the pomegranates. And I'm washing my brush. So the pomegranates are, of course, red, but they're a darker, cooler red. So I wouldn't necessarily use these reds because they're not dark enough and they're not cool enough. They look too saturated. So I'm probably going to use a mix between the purple and the red. So I can take maybe some of this red and mix a little bit of this purple. And then maybe start putting that in some of the shadow areas. So as I get to this light area, it might be slightly more red, but it's also not very saturated. So rather than taking the red, I might take some of the version that's slightly lighter that has some white in it, because white desaturates. So if you want a slightly desaturated version of a color, you can think about adding white or adding black to it. Go back to that shadow area color. There's a little bit of that highlight. I may just want to indicate it so I see where it is, and I can always refine that more later. I have some of these same colors now here. Mix some more of it. It's here too, but I notice that as it gets up that way, it starts to look a little bit more green. So I'll want to indicate that. By just picking up some green on my brush. Okay, and that little bit of green is there too. So now this area, it's pretty dark. And it's also very red too. So I'm just going to use some of that same color, maybe add some more of the purple to it. And so even though there's lots of little seeds in there, I'm not thinking about the individual seeds. So anytime you have a bunch of something, especially very tiny things, you want to think about the mass of it first. Like, what is the overall shape that it takes up? And then when we get into the details, we might just indicate a few of the seeds. We don't have to indicate all of them. We can concentrate on the ones where the light is turning, where you see the most texture. Okay, and this area in here, slightly lighter. You see how it's still trial and error, you know, like you have to use some trial and error to figure this stuff out. So I don't want that area to look too bright. And there's some seeds here. I'm using a slightly lighter color than I did there because this is receiving light, but they're still dark, those seeds, so I'm going to just put this purpley color here. And now for this area, which is one of the most saturated areas of the painting, I can reserve the more saturated colors for that area. And that is what's going to make it feel very bright, like the light is hitting directly. So for this area, I'm going to try using this, see if it's the right color. Might be a little dark. Okay, I think that looks okay for now. It doesn't have a lot of definition right now, but I can add that later. It's a good approximation. Seeing some of that color up here. And that color is also here. And then the rest of that. So this part of the pomegranate is receiving more light than these areas. So I would have to add a little bit more light. And it also looks more yellowy too, like that same greenish purpley color. When you have all your hues pre-mixed out like that, even though they're desaturated, it kind of takes away a lot of the guesswork. Might need a little bit more green. Okay, and then it turns, the form turns. I'm going to wash my brush because it's getting too much paint colors on it. The form turns and it gets darker and it gets more red. So I'm going to go back to this color here and fill that in. There's also, this just has a lot of that same color here. There's some highlights that are there that I can address later. Okay, so I want to fill in the shadow areas. Now the shadow areas are going to contain a lot of the color. The light reflects off of the fruit into the shadow areas. So the shadows for the bananas are going to have a lot of green in them. The shadows for the orange is going to have a lot of orange in it. The shadows for the pomegranates are going to have a lot of red in it. So keep that in mind when you're painting your fruits. So I can take maybe some of the same color here and fill in the shadows. I'm trying to make them slightly transparent too. And then some of the greens. For the shadow. But keep in mind, light is bouncing off of the pomegranate on here too. So there's going to be a lot of color in the shadows. Okay, so I also want to paint in the background area. And I will show you what that looks like. Now I have some choices with the background. So my fruits are in a cardboard box, which, I mean, I could try to match the color that I'm seeing. But I also like the idea of maybe having some of the colors that are not in the positive space areas in the background, because that contrast is going to make these fruits feel slightly brighter. So the color that's not in here really is this bluish gray. So if I put some more bluish grays in the background area, that's going to make these fruits pop a little bit more.